For decades, there has been a tug of war between connectionism and symbolism, or between discrete and continuous, or perhaps you might prefer the terminology, between type 1 and type 2. Symbolism requires symbol processing as the most suitable model of cognition, which is to say the serial, syntactical and universal transformation of discrete symbols in computational algorithms, or in plain English, the kind of code that you write in Python could construct a valid model of cognition. The symbols, or variables if you like, serve as representations of external reality. In NLP, the symbolist would represent lexical semantics through an ontology or semantic network, typically manually created by lexicographers or domain experts. On the other hand, connectionism regards parallel and distributed information processing in the form of vectors and tensors as being the most salient model of cognition, that is, in other words, the application of artificial neural networks. In my opinion, the duality between discrete and continuous is fascinating. It seems to pervade absolutely every single aspect of reality itself. Now, since the 1980s, when connectionist methods started getting traction, a whole theory arose trying to postulate an alternative and unified theory of cognition. Smolensky, Rumelhart and McClelland, they devised a new model of cognition which is called the sub-symbolic paradigm, right? So connectionist models may well offer an opportunity to escape the brittleness of symbolic AI systems, but is it possible to marry them together, right, with an integrative or hybrid paradigm? What's interesting with almost all of these integrative approaches is that they use a type 1 model as the first-class citizen, right? Many are looking for ways to create a type 2 interface within a type 1 model, exactly as is the case with transformers and graph neural networks. So all of the dominant hybrid approaches are much closer to connectionism than symbolism. I mean, personally, I must say I'm quite interested in Chollet's conception, right, which is almost turning it on its head, having a first-class discrete model in the inner loop and a neural network in the outer loop, much like recent efforts in neural program synthesis.
So you basically embed meaning and grammar all together in categorical quantum mechanics. What you do get then is a quantum model of language. It can be called a quantum model of language. I didn't like to use the term at the time. Now I'm totally unashamed to use the term. What I think at the time was suddenly deep learning started to boom, 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 boom. And nobody had any other interest than deep learning. Everybody was obsessed with deep learning. Why not put language on a quantum computer? But Will, there are no quantum computers yet. That's not true, Bob. I'm going to work for a company called Rigetti, and I'm going to build them there. Great, that is really cool. Let's figure out how that works.
Now, Professor Bob Kirk met Professor Lambeck in the late 1990s, and a few years later demonstrated his categorical diagrammatic quantum formalism of quantum teleportation. Lambeck immediately recognized that these were the same thing as the pre-group categorical grammars that he had been using in language. It's fascinating that a chance encounter between two scientists could elicit a convergence of two completely different strands of research. Now, a pre-group categorical grammar, it consists of a lexicon of words, a set of types and relations between the words and the types. It's a little bit like Lego, but for language, right? You can declare the connectivity on the relations between the types. For example, the word met must plug into a noun on the right side and the left side. A beautiful diagrammatic calculus emerges when you draw lines between the contracting types when they're connected together. Now, Bob is a huge advocate of what he calls anti-Cartesian togetherness. It's a paradigmatic shift from reductionism to togetherness, right? So take this instance of a verb, right? A verb, it connects to an object, a subject, and the meaning of a sentence. The meaning can't be decomposed into parts. It must be reasoned as a whole, just like entangled particles violate independence and collapse as a whole, not as parts. This is something which is immediately noticeable in Bob's diagrammatic calculus. The interesting thing about language is that it's not really one-dimensional. It's broadcasted as a sequence of tokens, but those tokens have a hierarchical, self-referential relationship, requiring multiple dimensions to represent meaning. Language is also weirdly discrete, isn't it? So Bob and his collaborators were inspired by Smolensky's formalism of sub-symbolic natural language processing, seeking to unify the symbolic and the vector-based worlds by casting an utterance into a structured object representation, which is to say, decomposing it into symbols and roles, representing variable and value bindings and conjugations. These can then be projected into a vector space via a tensor product or an outer product and conjugated by simply adding the tensors together. Now, previously the NLP world was dominated by linguists and inspired by Chomsky's idea of using propositional deductive logic as the starting point for their grammar, which is frankly antithetical to vector spaces, right? Bob decided that this was overly onerous, and we actually needed to think about the abstract structure of text itself, the flow of meaning between the words. The thing that inspired this the most was when Bob discovered that a lot of the grammatical burden actually vanished when we use his quantum reasoning approach to collapse the complexity of the representations. The problem, though, is that these vector spaces were tricky to work with. Every grammatical structure would live on an entirely different vector space, and you couldn't make them interact in any way. The spaces were way too large. They blew up exponentially with the number of variables seen in the tensor products, which needed to be computed, of course. Remember, the inner products can only be computed if the tensors live on the same space, which would mean that they would need to have exactly the same grammatical structure. So with Lambeck's formalism, you could represent the grammar as a pregroup, with the vector spaces inside if you organize them as a category. This would not only verify the grammatical correctness of a sentence, but it could also project it into a compositional vector space. So we're effectively conflating vector space meanings and typed logic for grammars. So here, the types become vectors themselves, participating in tensor products evaluated over all of the possible type assignments. The tensor product superposes the types, allowing them to interfere constructively and destructively to amplify or attenuate different possible meanings. As more words across the text combine, the right meaning, the right interpretation should become ever more pronounced. So in this conception, the grammatical structure becomes an envelope over the vector space itself. And what's interesting for us now is that this isn't a machine learning conception. The roles and the symbols were hard-coded by humans, but Bob now thinks that deep learning can extract the symbols and the types from the text, and then his sub-symbolic formalism can do the rest. Now, Bob argues that his NLP conception becomes a continuous generalization of Montague-style Boolean value or, propositional logic semantics, where the sentences are merely true or false. In the same spirit, Bob argues that this elicits the ability to have degrees or probabilities of meaning, something which I'm fairly sure Walid Sabah and the traditional GoFi advocates would scoff at. Bob goes one step further, and he suggests that this new approach to grammar might actually represent an exciting new development in the space, perhaps one of the most exciting new developments since Montague himself. Now, on the other hand, we have quantum computing, a notoriously difficult engineering problem drawing tens of billions of investment dollars from the world's largest corporations and governments. They are fighting to capture a marketplace which is expected to reach $100 billion in the next decade. And not only is it hard to build a quantum computer, it might turn out to be even harder to program them. So far, only a handful of useful quantum algorithms have been designed, and configuring a quantum computer to calculate using those algorithms is itself a monumental engineering problem that will probably, interestingly, be driven by machine learning procedures. Bob has invented an interesting new pictorial formalism for quantum mechanics called ZX calculus. He's been working on it for the best part of the last 2 decades. He's written several fascinating textbooks on the subject. It allows almost anyone to reason about quantum circuits, entanglement, and quantum teleportation. Could NLP and quantum computing be a match made in heaven? Does it just so happen by cosmic accident that NLP is amenable to quantum computing? Bob thinks that quantum entanglement can be leveraged to dramatically collapse the calculation complexity of the superposition of possible meanings of a sentence using this lambic representation. This is because the compact closed category allows us to use Bob's diagrammatic quantum calculus to greatly simplify the computation required. So you might argue that Bob's approach is actually just no different from vector semantics in deep learning, and that he's essentially replaced vectors with types. So his approach might suffer from the same limitations of vector spaces in general, namely that they lack abstract structure, and the structure that they do have is not reversible or invertible. Once a tensor composition is obtained, its decomposition is undecidable, which is to say we can't go back to the constituents. So doing so would require symbolic variables and thus quantification. So GoFi people would still argue that a logical calculus is required in natural language processing. The symbolic or type 2 structure allows us to extrapolate better. Fodor himself argued that once a human understands what Mary loves Joe means, they would also understand what Mary loves Dave means via extrapolation. In other words, we need syntactic structure and compositionality of symbols and quantification. This isn't to say that we shouldn't use vectors at all. If we insist on eschewing symbols, vectors are still a good way of representing approximate meanings. Vectors have a nice compositional algebra, but on the flip side, vectors are not templates. They cannot extrapolate to infinitely different sentences or account for different variables, scopes, and quantifications. So Bob would argue that the use of logic in language isn't propositional in spite of Montague. He thinks that it's not based on the kind of discrete causal structures that you would find in Perl, for example, and that we should rethink what interference means beyond the binary or the true and false setting. Bob would also argue that his approach is not even committed to vectors, right? They're experimenting with continuous structures like density matrices and even crazier stuff, which the category or framework allows for. Bob would also be one of the first people to denounce vector spaces, right? Following von Neumann, who thought that they shouldn't be used as a formalism for anything. This is what got Bob started into the diagrammatic approaches for quantum reasoning in the first place. So the key concept for Bob is that what should really emerge from this conversation today is the concept of togetherness or interaction dynamics are super important. And also there are old results from semantics and computer science that propositional reasoning and probabilities simply can't live in the same world. They're completely different, but we need something new to replace them. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed the show today. I've had so much fun making it. Remember to like, comment and subscribe. We love reading your comments, and we'll see you back next week for Professor Gary Marcus and Professor Louis Lann. Peace out. We had Francois Chollet on the other week, and he was saying that he believes that human brains are actually discrete first, right, on the inner loops.
Oh yeah, the question was about whether there is some similarity with catastrophe theory. Like, I can't remember his name. There's a French-Belgian mathematician who got a Fields Medal for that. And so you see, there's a lot of topology in this analysis of things there. So that guy himself was very interested in education, and he was like one of the mathematicians who put forward in the strongest possible terms that development of reasoning of people is not spatial initially. It's not like geometrical. It's purely topological. It's like about pulling a rope on two sides and it moves without even having an understanding about different distances. So kids don't even understand the difference between short and small and stuff anymore. You can test this with kids. They don't have an understanding of what fits in what at a very young age. They only learn this later, but they already have some topological understanding. And I mean, Piaget did a lot of experiments with these things. So it's becoming sort of a new... I mean, my wife's an education specialist. She's now starting to do experiments with these things, like the sort of fundamental... So the topology is like a fundamental... I mean, we wrote some paper, like I've got one paper in Psychology Journal about that sort of stuff. Like in physics, when people analyze space-times, you got sort of different layers. You got like a causal layer, and then you bring in topological structure, and then geometrical structure, and blah, blah, blah. And it seems to be the same with humans, that the way we develop our understanding of space comes like with different layers of structure, and topology seems to be the first one. Like really this topological understanding. I mean, I don't know much about it, but I mean, it makes sense to me. I mean, if you look at a kid, it's clear that the sort of topology stuff is something they understand before they understand anything geometrical.
I have a question, which is because a lot of what we talked about today really has to do with whatever we want to call it, emergence, holism, togetherness. It's all the same sort of. Do you follow much sort of the philosophical debate of strong emergence? Like, is there such a thing as strong emergence? Do you believe that there is, and what if so, what is, say, the most crystal clear, the best case of strong emergence?
I don't really understand the distinction in general very well.
Right.
I don't really. I mean, I know the definition, but I don't really understand it. To be honest, it doesn't seem so dichotomic to me. I mean, this whenever people call something strong or weak, or whenever they try to measure something on a line, I usually I don't understand this. Because for me, things don't live on a line. Nothing lives on a line. Definitely nothing is binary.
Right. And you can formalize it in a way. So for example, quantum entanglement to me, I think is a simple example. Like, it's very clear mathematically.
Would you call it strong emergence?
Yeah, well, the variables are not separable. Flat out, they're just not separable. You have to analyze the entangled state as a whole. You can't analyze the individual probabilities. You can't assume independence. That just doesn't work. And so, to me, that's the definition of strong emergence.
Yeah,
would be an entangled state.
My statement then is pretty much there is nothing else than strong emergent in nature. Tell me something which is not strongly emergent. Explain me something, some phenomenon. I'm not talking about theories. I'm not talking about mathematical descriptions. I'm talking about real phenomena. Tell me a real phenomenon that's not strongly emergent.
Well, I've seen that argument made, for example, by other physicists that the only behavior in the universe is emergent behavior. That we don't even have access actually to the lowest level of the tiniest, most fundamental things, and we never will. That the only behaviors we observe are actually emergent behaviors. But I mean, staying away from kind of such a strong dichotomy, because it's not that useful to say everything is emergent, because then we can't talk about things that are not emergent. To me, it seems like quantum entanglement is a canonical example of something that's strongly emergent. And yet you'll find people that are so, their identity is so caught up in reductionism that they'll try and find some semantic way to argue that no, it's not really strongly emergent.
That also in itself was so bad in the 90s for theoretical physics. These people still fighting all this sort of quantum stuff, trying to put this in a classical world. That also did a lot of damage to the foundational stuff. That did a lot of damage to the community. And they're starting again. But now I think the quantum computing is strong enough to actually kind of like that people can completely neglect that sort of. But the way I see quantum mechanics, what it taught us was that we have been trying to make everything look non-emergent throughout all of history, and it sort of basically showed you can't get away with that. Really, stop doing that. You just can't get away with it. Here's the proof.
I agree.
But and part of this obsession with this non-emergent stuff and this Cartesian stuff is why the humanities and all that are so far behind in sort of scientific practices of mathematical nature, because the mathematicians and all the formalisms were never suited for these people and the sort of substance they deal with. It was never suited, because you have to go to this emergent. Of course, like what's interesting about two people? I'm not describing them individually, I mean, it's not very interesting. Like it's all about like the emergent stuff which happens if you put two things together. And the maths is only starting to go. So now there is a new community which is called applied category theory community, and that's the sort of stuff they're looking at. But I mean, not just social, also like in engineering, because engineering needs that sort of math too,
Sure, yeah. Like a steel bar has rigidity because it's an emergent property. It's not a property of iron atoms.
Welcome back to the Machine Learning Street Talk YouTube channel with me, Tim Scarf, and my two compadres, Dr. Yannick Lightspeed Kilcher and MIT PhD, Dr. Keith Duggar. Now, in today's show, we have Bob Coecke, who is a celebrated physicist. He's been a physics and quantum professor at Oxford University for the last 19 years. He's particularly interested in structure, which is to say logic, order, and category theory. He's well known for work involving compositional, distributional models of natural language meaning. And don't worry, we'll go into what we mean by that later. There's a lot of jargon already. He's fascinated with understanding how our brains work. He's supervised 50 PhD students at Oxford, and he's been cited over 7,000 times. He's got an H index of 40. And last but not least, Bob was recently appointed as the chief scientist at Cambridge Quantum Computing. Now, Bob argues for a paradigmatic shift from reductionism to togetherness. He thinks that the concept of togetherness or abstract systems thinking has suffered in the sciences, and especially in physics, where all of the effort has been spent describing the individual, reinforcing fractionation at every possible opportunity. He cites the theory of everything in physics as being the most egregious manifestation of this dogma. Indeed, our own understanding of the human brain has already made it abundantly clear that we should be studying brains in not in isolation, but rather their interactional dynamics. Now, Bob thinks that interactions between systems in quantum mechanics actually carries over naturally to how word meanings interact in natural language. He argues that this interaction kind of embodies the phenomenon of quantum teleportation. Now, is this a revolutionary idea, or is it a gratuitous use of quantum reasoning? Well, this is something that we're going to be discussing in the show today. Now, Bob absolutely hates symbolic reasoning with a passion. He has dedicated much of his career to alternative pictorial formalisms for reasoning about categorical logic and quantum circuits. Bob invented ZX calculus. It's a graphical calculus for revealing the compositional structure within quantum circuits to show entanglement states and protocols in a visually succinct but logically complete way. Von Neumann himself didn't even like his own symbolic formalism of quantum theory, despite it being widely used. Now, ZX calculus makes it so simple and visual that even high school students can perform quantum reasoning, which is usually the preserve of Hilbert space aficionados. So anyway, ZX calculus is outlined in exquisite detail in Bob's 900-page book, which is called Picturing Quantum Processes. And he also has a new book coming out describing his ZX calculus, which I've had the pleasure of reading, by the way, aimed at high school students. So keep an eye out for that. Anyway, Bob, it's an absolute honor and a pleasure. Welcome to the show. Tell us about your intellectual journey over the last 2 decades.
Oh la 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 la. Okay, where do we start? So, I started off as a very non-intellectual teenager, but I was politically active, and I thought the only way anybody would ever listen to me was to go study the most difficult thing at university. So I started engineering. Then I got a course in quantum physics, and I hated it. I just deeply hated it, so I didn't want to do it. So I went to study architecture. Then I had an internship in the real world, and I absolutely hated it. So I said, I don't want to be in the real world. Okay, so then I studied physics anyway, and maths, and I kind of then learned that von Neumann, like you said earlier, kind of hated his own quantum formalism too. So on that point, I went into a journey of trying to come up with a new quantum formalism. This wasn't a particularly popular thing to do in the 90s, when the theory of everything people, which you also mentioned at the time, string theoreticians, were completely taking every single job in theoretical physics. So I ended up on the unemployment market. I tried my luck as an artist again, completely failed. I was then very lucky to end up in a computer science department in Oxford in 2000. For the single reason that they want to learn some physics there, and I happen to know some category theory and logic, which these computer scientists know. They took me in. 6 years later, I was faculty. I built out a big group. So, the group at the time of leaving was about 50 people. It's one of the largest, both quantum groups and category theory and logic groups in the world, I guess. I became faculty 2006 and full professor 2008. And then recently I felt it was clear that our work that we had been doing was starting to move into quantum industry with companies like, you see presence of that now in companies like Google and IBM. So I said, probably time for me to mingle in the real world a little bit too. And so that's what I started doing. And also I got really disappointed with the way universities were going. I should add that too. That's how I find myself where I am now. But I've always wanted to be a rock star, but completely failed.
Could you expand just a bit on your disappointment in universities? I'm just really curious about that.
Oh, so I don't want to go into too much politics here because this still weighs heavy on my shoulders because it's a fairly recent experience. But like the incredible increase in management structure basically has changed universities from a home to academics to some brand that uses academics as resources. It's just and you see these things now also in the UK happening with managements closing entire departments. For example, maths and computer science are being closed in Leicester at the cost of like a big artificial intelligence department. That's the sort of, so I mean this is probably going to be part of our discussion, but I see a big danger here coming from the machine learning sort of side, which is very similar to the disaster which happened in the 90s coming from the string theory side. That they are like in the heads of like stupid managers are going to push away a lot of other stuff because they only see one thing in the news.
I saw something very similar. So part of the reason I eventually found my way out of academics is, I used to be naive and I thought it was really the ivory tower where the only thing that mattered was the pursuit of truth. And if you had sufficient evidence or a proof of something, that everyone around you just had to accept it because now you have a proof for that. But I started to find out that it's really heavily influenced by money and politics, just like every other kind of human endeavor.
So I can talk about my 20 last years in the UK. Like in the beginning, it was academic paradise here. Really, it was academic paradise, especially at a place like Oxford. You genuinely it wasn't really entirely ivory tower, but you had entire freedom, and what got respected were really cool, great ideas. Because they allowed me in a computer science department to develop this diagrammatic approach to quantum stuff, which was really like the sort of freedom you're hoping for in even an ideal academic environment. But gradually, politicians started to get their hands on funding organizations, and then the funding organizations were made more powerful, more management staff. They got all bigger egos, and they started to think that they were actually running the academic world, not the academics. They became pretty arrogant too, and this then carried over to the university managements because they were then interacting with this funding management, and I think the battle is already lost now. I think the battle is really lost, and then also department heads become equally stupid after a while, and I mean, for me, I mean, I saw it going worse and worse, but then the attempt of me to trying to get a split position, half academics, half private sector, really showed me how bad it was.
Yeah, I had one of my well, let me step back a little bit. Someone I knew at MIT who was a professor there. I don't want to sufficiently narrow it to get it down, but it had a theory that actually the ball on this kind of got rolling a little bit post World War II, at least in the United States, because in a large part World War II was won through technology, right? It was a technological battle as much as anything else. And so post World War II, at least, the United States government said, wow, this technology stuff is great. Like, we need more of it. We got to start dumping money, into research. And of course, they need some way of figuring out who to get the money to, right? And so at that time, they could look at academic publications and say, well, you've got 10 publications in this journal and you've got 15 over here. So we can have a gauge by which we can measure, who we might allocate money to. And of course, game theoretically, this is now going to result in a kind of unintended side effect where, if they're using papers as the measure of publications as the measure by which money is doled out, we got to get some more publications. And so you start to see this explosion and eventually exponential explosion and journals and numbers of publications and everything because of this kind of, money corrupting the system.
It is a game now, and also the way things are set up with grants and all that, I'm sure that this is a losing game. The amount of time people are putting in grant, not only sort of in work time, but stress time, psychological damage and all that, like broken marriages. I don't know. Right. Just because of the amount of stress. And it's like you either get it or you don't get it. There's nothing in the middle, and the majority doesn't get it. So they're just working their ass off without any reward, just stress, and then a management. I mean, I know examples of people who didn't get tenure because they didn't get a huge major grant, while the chances to get it are so small. It's all absurd and ridiculous. I mean, and it's been getting worse. Also, you mentioned the publication thing. It's a game. It's not about what are the really most promising long-term pieces of research? What is the stuff which people are still going to talk about 20 years from now, 50 years from now? No, it's like, who get that paper? And I mean, you gave an example of the X calculus. If you look, for example, this got blatantly rejected wherever we submitted this for a while. If you now look at the sort of things which got accepted for these conferences, these top conferences, just in citations, well, this is not really even citation hungry work. We got way more citations than all other papers together that got accepted.
What's the solution to that, though? Because we were speaking to Mark Serafin recently, and he says that now academics has changed to, you almost need to be a media company. OpenAI is a media company. And what we're doing now actually is a form of mediation. So do academics need to be much better at telling narratives and stories about their work?
I think academics, as we knew it, is never going to come back anymore. That's my belief. And in general, like anybody in society, these sort of skills indeed need to become part of it, at least of part of a team or something like that. There's just no way around it. I mean, I'm sure some branches of mathematics where they still solve like these incredibly difficult problems for which you have to be pretty much an autistic, like whatever. That's going to stay. I'm pretty sure. There are some things which just can happen only in an ivory tower or in some little village somewhere in Russia, So these things are, I think, going to stay, but the sort of more exciting stuff is going to move more. I mean, this has all been going, like for example, in theoretical physics, you got institutes like the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics in Waterloo. So more and more private research institutes are going to come out of the ground because it's going to be the only way to get kind of protected from all the other pressures. I mean, I can't put forward the model, but clearly the old model is not working anymore.
I mean, it's interesting what you're saying, that this also in computer science comes from the AI departments, and I see this in real time. As a very recent graduate of academia, during the time I was here, so from the beginning of my PhD, the Institute of Machine Learning within the Department of Computer Science, it just grew from like one professor to 3 or 4, actually to 3 at that point. And now this institute is like almost as big as the rest of the department together. So just professors get hired and hired and hired for machine learning. And not even that, but all the other groups, even though they are not machine learning, they might be systems or networks or security, they're doing machine learning too. Like they're like, how can we apply neural networks to malware detection or to routing traffic and so on? I
mean, this is to some extent justified because there is some sort of, I would call this an Edison moment going on with machine learning. I mean, the ideas aren't really new. The whole idea of a neural network has been around for I don't know how long. But this is the moment, just like Edison could put like a city on light, that it actually is ready and the machines are there to actually bring this in society in a way that's actually going to be transformational for society. So it makes a lot of sense that this is given a lot of attention and all that. But now I hear some figures like in the public media speak that like machine learning is going to blow away any other discipline in science and all that, like, and stuff like that, which was what the string theoreticians were saying about theoretical physics. And that's, of course, pretty dumb. Like, I mean, it's great. I mean, we should embrace it. It's a fantastic tool, the learning tool. But it is what it is. Just like electricity didn't blow away all the other sciences when Edison lighted up the city, I mean, it enriched them all. People could just could suddenly work in the dark, You could do your philosophy in the dark because Edison gave you light. So it did help all other sciences. And of course, like we've seen this revolution. I mean, when I think about CS revolution, what happened between like 90 and 2010 with IT and internet and mobile telephony and the availability of laptops, that's transformed science like crazy. But it didn't make computer science like swallowing up all other sciences. No, it was an amazing tool that was provided. So I'm seeing machine learning in a similar way. There's, of course, conceptually a very new idea there. This was the same with the sophisticated computer science operation systems that you have on a phone. This was also revolutionary. sort of
Yeah.
know-how and new structures and new ideas that went into that.
I was meaning to transition a bit because this thing, you know, of one discipline coming in, be it string theory, be it AI, that sort of pushes out all the other research. Some degree is, of course, justified, but it almost seems like a bit too much at points. It seems like you're making a similar point in the world of natural language processing, where, you know, the dominant approaches are sort of, let's just all put this into vectors and let's just have them linearly and non-linearly intermingle with each other until we get a number out at the end. Could you shed a bit of light on what you think about the current developments?
I had expected I would actually be confronted about that, but you're actually feeding it in me with the spoon. So
give it time.
So, I mean, I've seen things evolve because I had no background in natural language at all. There's like sort of a funny story is that I was a postdoc in 2000 at McGill, and I went there with a plastic bag, and I had no place to stay. So Jim Lambeck, who's like the father of categorical grammars, going back to the 50s and all that, he said, "Oh, Bob, you can stay in my house. It's big and I live alone." It was at a time in the mid 80s. So he was talking to me. I knew him from all the work from before in category theory. He said, "Yeah, I'm doing language stuff again and blah, blah, blah." I didn't take any attention. Then 4 or 5 years later, I was giving a talk at McGill about my diagrammatic quantum formalism, categorical diagrammatic quantum formalism. And I was explaining quantum teleportation. And he said, "Hey, these are pre-group categorical grammars." He was sitting there himself, like Lambeck, and he saw me explain teleportation. And he said, "These are pre-group categorical grammars. There is nothing mystical about that because you mentioned this in your introduction that I said teleportation." But Lambeck immediately recognized the grammatical structure when I was just trying to explain teleportation in our new way. I didn't pick this up, and then 1 or 2 years later, Steve Clark, who was until recently at DeepMind and now just joined my team, he was then faculty at Oxford. He explained the problem at the time that there was this complete separation between people starting to do vector model. It was not at all that the neural nets were dominating at the time, by no means. And then more traditional people using, because he had done a lot of parsing, and so people using like a grammatical gadget. And Steve Pullman was too at Oxford, and he had sort of put the challenge to Steve, like, how can we combine those two? And then Steve had been reading a little bit in Smolensky, like the connectionist and all, blah, blah, blah. Smolensky was using tensor products to like bring in some way grammar and meaning together. But I mean, it was kind of very hard to handle because each sentence with a different grammatical structure would live in a completely different space. So you couldn't make them interact in any way. And the spaces were humongous. You ended up doing something like Fock space, which is the space in which the huge space in which physicists do quantum field theory, you know. So we then came up together with Steve in a very elegant way to combine the two, and this really came from the fact, like Lambeck remarked, that the two have exactly the same structure: grammar in the form of pre-groups and vector spaces if you organize them in a category, which means you don't have just single vector spaces, but you also compose multiple together. So if you've got a string of words in a sentence, then you kind of compose them together in a bigger space. And if you do it like that, and then you respect your spaces, also respect the grammatical types from the grammar theories, then you can just like use your grammatical structure as an envelope. An envelope is, I think, a good word. An envelope on top of your vector space structure, which guides grammatical compositions. So we got ourselves an algorithm then. And we were really excited about that. And at that time, we got like a lot of attention. We were on the cover of New Scientist and all that with that stuff, which was really crazy for me because I never made a cover of New Scientist with any physics. So I knew nothing about linguistics, but that was sort of, and we were in Scientific American. So it got a lot of attention, but then boom happened. And you know what the name of boom was? The name of boom was machine learning. So suddenly people stopped, all the attention and the energy was, of course, going there. Now, we also had a little problem at the time. And the little problem we had is if you start combining vector spaces with tensor products, they become very quickly very big. They blow up exponentially. So the people working with us who were doing the experiments, they had really a hard time like building the tensors of things like verbs, because these were products of multiple spaces. And it was really hard to get this properly on a classical machine. I then start to write this book. And so to some extent, the attention around this approach went down a bit, and my interest also went more to cognitive modeling personally. Like, I think I saw this, I really wanted to more understand how our brain worked. But then, like, quantum computers came around, and I mean, we've always known that if there would be quantum computers, this stuff wants to live on a quantum computer because essentially it's a quantum model.
Can we address? We'll address the quantum stuff later. So I think that's the.
Together. It goes hand in hand.
Well, just for now, let's try and disentangle the two for if you'll pardon the pun. But yeah. I'm really interested in this because there has been a kind of revolution in NLP over the last decade or so, and actually there are many people who would argue that it's a complete dead end, this whole vector approach, deep learning and so on. But for decades post Chomsky, the theories and the models were derived from the field of linguistics, right? And they were quite introspective and rules-based in general. And actually, a lot of the stuff you're talking about, this Lambert calculus or categorical grammar, it kind of derived from Montague and Chomsky and all this kind of stuff. So it changed in the 1990s. Everything became increasingly empirical and statistical and data-driven. And I think the watershed moment for me was Mikolov's word-to-vec model, which popularized the idea of placing words and sentences in a Euclidean vector space. And the results were pretty impressive, and they afforded a whole bunch of clever text processing, especially since the Transformers evolution of this idea, which arguably extends the embeddings beyond just a bag of words, but introducing some structure. But anyway, you have an entirely different view of this. So as I say, you're going back to this categorical grammar and so on, and think we should move back to the Chomsky view. Now, the thing is, these old methods...
Not exactly. You can continue, but I just want to say at this point, not exactly, but okay.
If we did go back to this grammar view of natural language processing, I think the reason that we abandoned it was that there were quite a few edge cases, right? Doesn't always work.
This has to do with what one means by symbolic reasoning, or let's say let me call it non-statistical, because I want to put a much bigger umbrella there than the sort of going back to. So, of course, a lot of the traditional work, like from Lambert and Chomsky and all that, they had a very propositional logic starting point. So a lot of the sort of structures were very similar to propositional logic. Now, one doesn't have to sort of do empirical work or anything like that. If one really looks carefully at the mathematical structure, then one sees that there is a complete mismatch, a complete and utter mismatch between, on the one hand, vector space-like structures, and on the other hand, propositional deductive systems. They don't fit together. There's no way to get the two together. So if you want to sort of take, on the one hand, anything like symbolic propositional systems, be it like categorical grammars or anything like that, on the other hand, vector spaces, you're never going to get them together in a decent way. But that's why I think any attempt of people to combine them, just approaching them like that, was bound to fail. These are things computer scientists understood for a very long time on a very abstract level. Like if you want to combine probabilistic semantics with non-deterministic semantics, it doesn't fit together. It doesn't work. They don't like it. So one has to start at a different level. So our starting point is not anything deductive, propositional, symbolic, or anything like that. Our starting point is what we call compositional structure, and that's really try to see how things flow within a sentence without having any logical presumptions or anything like that about that. Just see how things flow in each other. And this is very recent work, which actually we're just finishing the papers for now. We actually went back to look at grammatical structure, Lambert, Chomsky, and all that, and we saw that this is full of unnecessary bureaucracy. From the perspective I was just talking about, like just understanding what are the sort of backbones of the flow of meanings between different words, also within text. So a lot of that is, and now this brings me back to the grammatical paradigm, that we humans, poor creatures, can only speak one-dimensional. We can only put words in a string. We can't speak like words in a two-dimensional sort of surface. We can't do that. But if you carefully analyze grammar, then you see that the real essence, what's really universal, lives in a plane. It doesn't live on a line. And you may think, okay, therefore it's more complex because it's two-dimensional. No, it's actually you take something two-dimensional and you squash it into one dimension, and then there's a lot of order bureaucracy which comes in because you have to decide what comes for what. And as you know, in different languages, different decisions have been made on this bureaucracy, for example. On the other hand, these decisions also come with stylistic options on how to organize different things to do your poetry so you can get your rhyming word at the end and all that. So there's a lot of positives about this bureaucracy, but it makes it incredibly complex to handle in any scientific manner. So that aspect alone, I think, is a reason of the big failure of trying to combine or integrate this sort. I mean, this is something machine learning is really good about, this bureaucracy. Like learning styles, learning stylistic features. They're very good at do this with images. And so that's the stuff you don't want to put in your fundamental structure. So so you know how we discover this? By putting grammatical structure on a quantum computer when we have to put it in circuit form. We actually saw that a lot of garbage from the grammatical calculi vanished. It was lost. It was lost. So it was kind of accidental by forcing the grammar into a quantum circuit that we saw that actually. And so my new attempt there, which is still very much developing, is like to start from this. I would call this machine grammar, this two-dimensional grammar. That's how machines want to talk to each other with some sort of grammatical content. And it's so much simpler than the sort of usual, all the stuff like Lambeck, Chomsky, Montague is so much way more complicated than necessary.
Could you maybe give us an example to make this a bit explicit? You know, I see, like, the point that I understand so far is that let's assume for a moment that language is really good or would be really simply displayed in 2 dimensions, and then, you know, since we can only put words one after another, we sort of have to have all this complicated stuff. It is not really concrete to me yet.
To draw pictures, you have to draw pictures. So just to give you a simple example, if you got a sentence like Alice loves Bob, you got 2 agents, Alice and Bob. So this is what the story is about. So think of a circuit where you're, I'm thinking some sort of quantum circuit. So you got your 2 lines, they're Alice and Bob. So you start off, there is no connection between Alice and Bob. We don't know who Alice is, we don't know our Bob. Think of it like so maximal noise. Okay, suddenly the sentence conveys a new idea to us. Alice loves Bob. So it's as if there is a gate, like a logic gate, that now acts on Alice and Bob and connects them, like a C-not gate. It entangles them. Okay, next sentence. Bob loves Claire too. Oh, that's another gate between Bob and Claire. Next sentence. Alice slaps Bob. Of course, she's not happy with the Claire situation. That's another sentence. So, and the meanings throughout this text, the meanings of Alice are evolving. You know, Bob and Alice are evolving, and they get entangled with each other because of the new relationships emerging. And this is a very simple example from simple subject-object verbs, but we got an algorithm to translate all of English to these.
Could I touch on that then? Because I think that's a wonderful example. So I think the genius of Montague was that he showed that Alice could be replaced by any other entity that the grammar allowed, right? Any other noun phrase. So you could replace Alice with a girl in the 6th grade, or 6th grade with red hair and a long ponytail, or some beautiful girl from my school. So that was what the formalism was about. So the meaning would be fixed.
Yeah, so this is not entirely true anymore here, because we have to keep track on who Alice is throughout the text. So in the Montague stuff, you abstracted away like of this is just a noun type. So it's for us it's very important which different nouns are. So we have to do some resolution there, some resolution of it. But the more important thing is they also had something like a unique sentence type that doesn't hold for us anymore neither. Because the sentence type will be determined by the sort of nouns which occur in your sentence. And so the circuit actually, the gate applies to those nouns which appear in the sentence. So it's a little bit more syntactic structure. So we have to label our nouns in order to do what we do. We have to be flexible with sentence type, because if you got an intransitive verb, the sentence type will typically be a single noun. If you got a transitive verb, it will be a double noun. If you got a intransitive verb, it will triple nouns. So there is a variation there. There's a variation there, because one of the big difficulties we had initially in our experiments with our model, which combined grammar and meaning, is we didn't know what a sentence type was. We had no good candidate for a sentence type. And the story I'm just telling now with the circuit solves all that. There is no real, the sentence type is kind of the scope of the part of the world where your sentence applied to. So it's local. While in the old approach, it was a global thing. It was sort of the universe, conceptually speaking. You can never deal with something like that because it's infinitely large, conceptually speaking. That's why, Montague semantics was really just trying to squeeze logic back into language, quantifiers and all that stuff. And that's exactly where I think it works really bad when you go to vectors. So most of the Montague stuff is really gone if you pass to vectors. You can't retain that.
Okay, so, earlier you kind of made this reference to the sort of propositional paradigm, if you will, kind of imposes all this garbage that can sort of be, abstracted or eliminated when it's kind of in the quantum paradigm. But, part of the reason for the development of those paradigms was that, like Tim brought up, if you instead, that sentence said something like, a girl in the 6th grade with blonde hair, loves Bob, you're not going to actually be able to resolve the meaning of that until much further on. Like in your circuit, it's going to have to maintain a bunch of low-level entanglement that much further on, maybe 7 layers up in the analysis or something, needs to get resolved. So it's kind of like the garbage actually has just gone from top down to bottom up. It's like now we're maintaining a bunch of garbage bits at the bottom that are entangled that actually much later on will be eliminated. Is that fair?
Yeah, yes, exactly. So one of the nice thing of a quantum-like formalism, and which goes back to von Neumann, is that so vectors. Everybody knows what vectors are like, and then von Neumann realized very early on when developing quantum mechanics that there are many situations that you don't know exactly which vector you're dealing with. So something happens and you don't know exactly which vector. And so he invented this thing called density matrices. Density matrices are a way to encode ambiguity on top of vector spaces. So it's intrinsic in our approach to, I think it's the way forward to actually use density matrices instead of vectors. So they have a lot of advantages. First of all, they allow you to encode ambiguity. So whatever ambiguity, be it with pronoun resolution or be it with lexical ambiguity, it's all implicit in this density matrix formalism, and you can wait until it gets resolved at a later stage. So you just carry the different options around until they get resolved. This is something we actually did experiments with in 2012, 2013, to the extent you can do them on a classical computer, because again, your spaces become bigger. Again, density matrix, you tensor 2 spaces. Quantum computer comes for free. If you got normal vectors, you got density matrix too. If you got if you got separable vectors, you got entangled vectors too. All comes for free. So it's a big part of this story to make it feasible.
So a couple of points on this. By the way, the main reason why I think deep learning is broken, and our friend Dr. Walid Sabah has certainly influenced my view on this, is the missing text problem. I'm not sure if you've heard about this, but in language, we don't say everything we mean, right? So, for example, the corner table wants a beer. We know that the corner table is a person. We've done that deductive reasoning. So spoken language is extremely ambiguous. It's actually a form of compression. We transmit the minimum amount of information, and the receiver can decompress the meaning using reasoning out of all of the possible meanings, right? So using your grammar and formalism for NLP is in some sense ignoring this key problem, right? Because being able to do the semantics is not helpful if you don't have all the information in the first place. NLU is about uncovering, in my opinion, the single human thought behind an utterance. And this formalism, by the way, inspired by Montague, he himself admitted that figuring out different meanings in different contexts was not what he was even working on. He was working on building a kind of formal natural language compiler. He admitted that there would need to be an understanding module on the top. So this is something that affects deep learning as well, but surely it affects your approach as well.
Sure, yeah. So from the start, the sort of experiments we had been doing was always focusing on ambiguity. So there's different levels of ambiguity. So there's first the ambiguity of a bank can be, a queen can be a rock band, and queen can be a royal, and queen can be a bee. And so that's level 1 ambiguity. Then you got ambiguity of parsing. Like if I say black metal fan, this can be a metal device, and this can also be somebody goes to a black metal concert, and if you look at it, like they parse differently. To start, they parse differently. They're not just different meanings; they're different grammatical structures. So you need to be able to keep that into account, and the sort of if you think of your vector space formalism as part of the way people have set up a quantum formalism with density matrices, there's no problem with that. Quantum information theory is all about dealing with these ambiguities. So you got a channel. A channel is always noisy. It's always mixed. You always got ambiguities and all that. So formally, you can actually deal with these things. We actually are now starting to put this on in experiments. The quantum computers aren't good enough, so we're putting this on classical machines. The only thing we can really do at the moment, we're putting it on classical machines, and we're starting to play around with this. But I know the places where this formalism at successes, the most successes experimentally so far, was about disambiguation and things to do with ambiguity. It's been pretty good at that from the start. So, but we haven't pushed this far enough. But I completely agree with you. So what you're talking about now is the ambiguity of a developing piece of text, for example, where you don't have, where there's lots of stuff you don't know, and maybe the black metal fan only occurs like 10 lines later, and so you really need to go back, carry your possible grammatical parsings around, and like in some sort of tree, think of it as a tree with your possibilities, and then later branches of the trees vanish away. But the thing about density matrices and what's called completely positive map is that all that stuff get bundled together in one map. All these branches get bundled together in one map, and they exploit the linear structure for that. They actually exploit the linear structure to do this in an economic way. That's an invention from von Neumann from the 1920s, which is remarkable to me that piece of math has never been used outside of physics. It's shocking. It's shocking, especially since everybody's now working with vectors everywhere.
I think what there is a level of ambiguity on top of that, and maybe Tim's point was more to that, in that in a lot of text, if you just read the text and you can parse it perfectly, like I can give you the parse tree, all of the, and I can give you all the references and all of that, all the meanings of the ambiguities of words, there is still a lot of things that is not anywhere in the text, right? Where you need to know the world. So like when Tim tells me something, he makes some assumptions about who I am and what I know, and then he doesn't say the things anymore. Like, he texts me like, we're on in 60 minutes. Like, this means nothing if it's not in the context of us being, so how does this go into a system that sort of deals in this circuit structure?
I think the information is not in the data. I think that's
I agree.
would say.
So to some extent, part of this is embodiment. So one of the things we learned from the older generation AI is the need for embodiment. So one thing we are working on now. So I mentioned the density matrices as one kind of alternative to vector meanings. So another thing, which again I'm working on literally today, is like replacing vector space meaning with something which is more like a giving the structure of the space or the representation space the illusion that it actually has a body that can move in physical space, a body that can observe physical space around it, so that you can actually point to things, which is a little bit like what you were just referring to with the studio thing, that the ability to, for example, use your arms and point, to smell, to hear, to taste. So we're building new spaces which have like taste, and some of this is based on work by Gardenforce. So this cognitive psychologist who came up with certain convex spaces for representing things which are much closer to our human senses. So what you want to do then is try to learn your stuff relative to these spaces. Again, I'm not talking about going back to rule-based, bring propositional reasoning about space. No, nothing like that. So you bring in the context of space as a structure. There's a hell of a lot of structure. Like just read Euclid's book. There's a hell of a lot of stuff going on there, but you don't want to stick all the rules of Euclid's book in your system. No, you just just tell the system, well, instead of a vector space, part of our representation space is 3 + 1D physical space we live in. Let's learn again that space, and then probably you're going to get inferences which come from the structure of the space and the way the space is related to taste. So if close to the loo, it stinks. That's stuff you want to get.
I think this is fascinating because the first thing is there's some question about whether we should have a discrete inner loop or a continuous inner loop, because this whole idea of vector spaces, as you say, that there might be ambiguity in the representation, but certainly in the original human thought behind an utterance, there is no ambiguity at all. It's a binary decision. There was one meaning, no degrees of freedom, no ambiguity whatsoever. So you're talking about projecting into these spaces, and with the missing information problem, vector spaces aren't enough. You have to perform something like a syllogism or some basic reasoning to fill in the information as a function of some common knowledge. So you can't just have the vector spaces, right? You need something else.
Yes, exactly. Exactly what I mean. And so the way we think about these spaces now is you got all these different components like physical space, maybe smells, maybe taste, maybe other sort of modes of representation. And then again, you like most vector space representations are fairly monolithic. So you got your big space in which you represent your different meanings. It didn't change that much since like the bag of words model there. Like the way we think of this is you got these different factors of your spaces, and all the things between them are entangled. For example, a banana, I mean, if a banana is green, it's going to be bitter and it's going to be hard. So there are these different correlations between the different spaces. If it's black, it's going to be very soggy and slimy and whatever. If it's yellow, it's going to be fairly sweet and tasty. So you've got these relationships across these different sort of factors, and that's going to give you like entailment power. A predictive entailment power. That's the idea. Of course, these are ideas we are just starting to play around with. They were in papers of us like 4 or 5 years ago, but we are starting to only now play around this experimentally. And it's going to give a completely different paradigm. Now, I'm not going to say that. So the way I think about new science is the most stupid thing you can do if you come up with something new is going to sort of directly compete with what already exists. Because a new thing will tell you it by itself what it wants to be used for. And this may not be necessarily the same thing as the state of the art is doing now. It may be a completely different thing for what it is good. I mean, if you look at the history of science, it's always been like that. People invented classical mechanic to actually to sail with their boats following the stars. You know, that was the purpose. That was the purpose of like Copernicus and Kepler. It was about coming up with good maps for both. And by the way, because we're talking statistically driven stuff here, Ptolemy's model was much better than either Copernicus and Kepler. Ptolemy's model, going back like 800 years before, was a statistically purely, was Byzantine culture, statistically driven approach, was way better than anything Copernicus and Kepler ever did. As far as using ships, using the data in ships went. But you know, I mean, people don't realize this, but Ptolemy knew relativity in some way, because the data represented like relativistic corrections. It did. It was just statistical data, so they were doing curve fitting. They were doing curve fitting on epicycles. So I mean, I've had some discussions, the sort of discussion we now having against the between the symbolism and so I like to use the word aware. I'm sort of saying like our system is grammar aware, and the thing I was more recently talking about was we want to be space aware, like physical space aware. And then people say, yes, but deep learning networks are also grammar aware. The grammar is there and it reproduces the grammar. But it's grammar aware in the same way as Ptolemy was relativity aware. It reproduces the correct predictions of relativity theory without Ptolemy having a clue about the actual theory of relativity. So that's sort of the difference. It's not a theory sort of popping out of your statistical system. Your statistical system reproduces the predictions of the theory, but it's not sort of aware of the theory. And that's kind of a subtle difference, I say. I mean, awareness is where you can actually make inferences. That's what we humans do. Like we make inferences because we are aware of the physical space. And what you were just giving the example of, like start recording, is exactly about this awareness, like knowing that Yannick is there in the studio and can push a button or something like that.
I'm really glad that you said what you did for the last few minutes, because, you know, going back to like kind of the academic stuff we talked about earlier, part of the problem is people have this tendency to really want to find silver bullets, right? Like they want the one true method that will solve all their problems. And I think there's really, if we step back and be objective about it, there's overwhelming evidence throughout all of our history that there are no silver bullets, that things are hybrid systems that require...
Exactly.
And so if I'm hearing you correctly, you're not saying that this paradigm is the silver bullet that's going to solve all NLP and, more importantly, NLU, natural language understanding problems, but it's a very important tool in the toolbox that happens to very nicely map a part of the mathematics of that domain to quantum computing, so we can get a very good, efficient implementation of a piece of it. But we still may need to do other types of computation around, on top of that, mixed in with it. Is that true?
I mean, of course. Like,
Okay.
Just think about like cylindrical versus Cartesian coordinates. You know, I mean, it's something like that. Like you know, one is useful in one place, one is useful in another place. I mean, I said it earlier. Like the stylistic stuff, machine learning is really good at. Like emulating AC/DC or emulating Picasso or something like that. It's incredibly good. And like, for example, in the linguistic context I'm talking about, I mean, it would be stupid of us to try to in any way emulate these abilities of deep learning, like to reproduce style. That's why I'm so happy with our new approach to grammar, where we actually get rid of style. So we say, okay, that's your domain. Let's see now if we can make the real core backbones of grammatical interaction. And I want to say something more about it later. Present, are there things we can do better? That's a question. Are there things we can do better? And places where I think we can be much more economical. We can be, for certain applications, we can be much more economical because you don't need to learn all the stuff. I mean, if you can take something because you know it already, maybe it doesn't work perfect in all contexts. Maybe you really need this ambiguity in certain contexts, but there will be contexts where it's actually good to actually get that piece for free, so that you can focus on something else. Same with the physical space. Maybe there are contexts where it's much better to try to learn the physical space because the space is so fucked up. But for many contexts, getting this piece of information, like thank you Euclid, like you did this all for us, like okay, let's make use of it. I mean, it's good to have it. I mean, just to get another context, like we have theories of physics like relativity and quantum mechanics. Are we now going to go to a paradigm that we're going to forget about them and say, oh no, let's machine learning do all of this again? It would be stupid. It would be stupid, yeah. So
some people want to, but no.
I know there are people who actually believe that. Like
the problem is with these deep learning models is they're a bit like a Parlour trick. They do a lot of things. So in the context of language processing, they have some world knowledge, for example. They have, you were saying, they have the illusion of understanding grammar. They don't really. They're just probabilistic likelihood models. They're just predicting the next word in a sequence. So they're extremely limited, but they appear on the surface to be doing very, very clever things, right? But the alternative is we take a step back and we start explicitly and discreetly formalizing grammar again, and then we get all the original problems we had. Like Yannick, you were saying, it's NP hard for doing the constituency processing and doing the parse trees and all this kind of stuff, right?
I never.
This is the wrong grammar. This is the bureaucratically overloaded grammar. The complexity comes from the bureaucratic overload. So all these things have to be revisited again. So now it's not just about, so this is the more important, it's not just about grammar. I don't think this grammar is something very specific to language at all. So because when we start building our spatial model, basically that's a theory of spatial relationships, like how different things can be related in space. A priori, this has nothing to do with language. A priori, because so these are just entities in space and they have certain relations, but this very naturally follows the same sort of grammatical umbrella. It's very natural to give the same grammatical umbrella. We've got a paper from a few years ago. It's called Interacting Conceptual Spaces, and we play the same game for Garden Force conceptual spaces. They obey very naturally the same umbrella. For me, the piece of grammar which remains, maybe we shouldn't call it grammar. Maybe it's kind of bad PR to even call it grammar. Whatever remains in the circuits, it's an interaction structure in the world. So just think of the like you got a prey, you got a predator, and you got a hunt. It's some sort of logical process, which so there is the process. It takes in two things, a prey and a predator, and there is a goal. So it's some sort of logical entity. And many things, if you in the world, have this sort of logical structure. And you can bring in more sort of grammatical ideas. They will then bring in like things like if you things have like adverbs and adpositions and things like that, they bring like higher order aspects of that same process. But it doesn't have to do anything with language per se. So what we're trying to retain is more sort of a structure of reality, which I wouldn't call it a logic because it has no propositional in the sort of Greek Aristotle way type of deductive power. It's really a way of fitting things together in the world. And the word I use is compositional, of course. It's a way of fitting things in a rational way together in the world. And you can come up with a model of physical space which follows a template. It's built in language. It's not a surprise because like our granddaddies, they were like trying to get down the mammoth. They were screaming at each other. So the language probably developed by their spatial sort of considerations, because if they didn't communicate their spatial consideration trying to get down the mammoth killed them all, So it was a matter of surviving, like language emerged from like survival.
Yeah. I mean, it's some really like there are too many interesting things here. Going back to what you were saying with some people want to go back and try to do relativity, throw it out, replace it with machine learning. I mean, the absolute madness of the world is that something like relativity even exists, right? That someone can write down like one formula. It's like, oh, here, just do, this metric tensor with the fourth dimension negative and bada bada boom. It describes the entire world. Like it describes a wide range and like the completeness almost of the world. Now, my question to you is, do you think something like this is even possible for how messy human language is, or something like human language? And second, what in your formalism or in your system, what is the required amount of human input? Like how much do you as a human have to, program, let's say, the structure of the world into the system for it to be able to then understand the world?
So about to your first, human language is a very messy thing. So I completely agree. So what we're trying to dig out is the non-messy part of it. Is there any way we can identify a non-messy part? And like I said, we already threw away this bureaucracy, which is language dependent, which is stylistic dependent, and all these things. And I think we got rid of a lot of the sort of noise of it, a lot of the sort of difficult stuff to really capture. And like I said before, I think part of the reasons people who have been trying to bring in grammar into sort of statistical schemes, I think they probably did something wrong, that they actually still believed that there was anything deductive going on there, because there's no way structurally you can ever blend this with a linear structure of a vector space. It's just never going to work. And the second part is they also were bringing in all this bureaucracy, which was unnecessary. So I'm really talking. So what I'm talking about is really a new theory of grammar. I'm going to be bloody arrogant here. I think it's the best thing in grammar that happened since Montague. And I mean, I'm super arrogant. I believe this. I've been telling this to people and person I'm working on it. I think this is the biggest thing in grammar since Montague. I mean, I believe this. I mean, I can't, we're writing it down. It's a really big deal. And it's incredible. If you look at the pictures, the amount of complexity that comes in by putting things on a line. It's incredible. We can depict this incredible complex network just by trying to stick a single sentence on a line, how complex the process is. On the second, so that was the first question. So the thing is that there is something underneath, I think, like relativity, because it's some sort of logic of how the world works. It's not language. Language takes that in. Language uses that as a backbone. Language is developed against that logic. So bringing in that logic into language will help understand language and simplify the understanding of language. But it's not all of language. It's not language. So that's why I completely disagree with Montague and Chomsky and all the other ones, that there is anything special about the structure of grammar with respect to humans. But I'm now talking about like the distilled, clean structure, which maybe we shouldn't call grammar, but what I'm still kind of calling grammar.
There's language, there's reality, and there's meaning, right? And I can understand how this compositional analysis could tell you something about, let's say, our language, and maybe you could use that as a proxy for reality in some sense, although that's a bit of a leap. But what about, syntax isn't semantics, right? Isn't that the fundamental problem?
In the way we're doing things, that separation doesn't really exist anymore that much, because a lot of the stuff we put in the domain of meaning actually is structure itself. So in the old-fashioned way of doing grammar, you really had you got the types, and then you got sort of your proof of correctness of the sentence and all that, and that all lived outside of the meaning of the words. We have to dig inside the meaning of the words and look at internal wirings within what usually we would call semantics to make it work, to actually get our circuits. There is an enormous amount of structure within the words themselves, within the semantics, and it seriously reduces the complexity of all these things. Because why did the vector bag of words work so well, for example? It took like an adjective and a noun and a verb all in the same space. There are two arguments for it. On the first hand, if you look at type theoretic structure or something like that, you say that this is absurd because an adjective is something which changes a noun into a different noun. It acts on a noun, so you expect it to be a map. But then again, when you say red, like as making something red, or a lot of these adjectives actually are kind of nouns in content. So you actually have to go inside the map of the adjective, stick this noun in there, and then do some wiring. And so that actually makes everything much more economical. And that's sort of part of our whole scheme, that we go inside the meanings and then do some structure inside the meanings, which sort of then kind of wires up with the grammatical structure and causes the incredible collapse in complexity. So the two come together. Now, there are simple things in English language, like the way we order adjectives. There is a clear structure on there. So that there are these 7 or 8 classes, and we put it, and this again this is kind of related. I see this as related when I say the meaning space is sort of factor in different substructures. Some are about size, some are about shape, some are about color, and these are really these factors which come into the space of adjectives. So that's something we have to recognize. And again, the order is what you could call syntax, because it sort of tells you rules on how to order things. Well, it's connected, but what defines where you live are meanings. Another example are, for example, prepositions. Most prepositions have spatial connotation, next, above, in. So they seem to make direct reference to spatial structure. If you're ever going to do inferences which involve prepositions, then you need to have some spatial awareness. So these all mixed up syntax and semantics.
Yeah, there's a couple things that I kind of want to talk about here. So I think it's a bit, it's a bit of an optical illusion to say that the complexity disappears, because what's happened is you've replaced the complexity with entanglement. So the complexity is all there. It's just in a quantum mechanical structure that you're kind of taking advantage of. And because the one thing I want to avoid is, in the beginning, I started to feel that you were not a reductionist, and I was happy about that because, you talked about togetherness, which to me is synonymous with at least holism or emergence or this kind of thing. The meaning of a word by itself is, blatantly not sufficient to define the meaning.
I completely agree.
Okay. So we are maintaining this complexity, the ensemble complexity, if you will, the emergent complexity.
Yes.
It's being maintained for us kind of, for free, although IBM would probably disagree with that, but, for free by quantum sort of structures.
When I said the reduction of the complexity in using your terminology now, it's like think of the meanings as some sort of wholes. Initially, they're sort of, we don't know what they are. They're Wittgenstein. They're determined by their context to a great extent, right? They're not sort of fixed status things.
Good.
So what I'm talking about is the complexity of the network that connects them together, and which then allows you to sort of, for example, variationally learn from the context what your meanings are. So it's the complexity of the network around them which simplifies. That's it. But that's exactly like I said. That's exactly. So the way we got to it was actually by having to put this stuff on a quantum computer, because a quantum computer forced us first to go 2-dimensional into a circuit, And then this is a very interesting story. I think people may not realize. Like when you get a course on quantum computing or quantum mechanics, then they teach you like, measurement. You can't get information out of your system because if you measure, you disturb, and you'll never get. It's impossible to sort of get the state out of your quantum system. Now it turns out in present day quantum computing, it's incredibly difficult to get your state inside the machine too. It's not just getting it out; it's getting it in too. And the quantum computing people who are trying to do relatively short-term stuff in chemistry and all that, the only solution they came up with to actually get something in a machine is using basically learning. So what you do is like you got some network, which is typically a circuit, like a quantum circuit, and then you got variables. Now these variables, they're actually classical variables in the sense that they're gate settings. They're gate settings. And then you basically train. You train your circuit and you adjust your gate settings. And that's the only efficient way at the moment people can get data in a quantum computer. So I don't think machine learning would ever have, the machine learners would have thought that they were actually coming up with a paradigm to actually get stuff into a quantum machine. I don't think they never thought, because you're not doing anything. It's purely for reasons of encoding your data that you use learning. So it's kind of a funky thing. So now let me explain what so these quantum computers are quite small at the moment. Like you can't do much, you can't go very deep. And what people do now, typically is they take one of these circuits and they kind of think of it as a neural network, if you want to. So it's just some network, some circuit with some gates and all that. But typically they don't mean anything. It's just whatever works best. Just like in typical learning, you take the structure of the network, the layers, whatever works best. Whatever works best, but it's very hard to assign an individual meaning to every node in your network. Like this is Alice, this is Bob. It doesn't work like that, you know. Like they're just nodes there. So our networks on the quantum computer, they represent like the grammatical interactions and all that between the different things. If you want the agents within the text, so they on the nose represent, they are meaningful. So that's where we get a big advantage, because you have to use them. There's just no other way to get your stuff into a quantum computer by then using these circuits. But for us, these circuits mean something. For all the rest, they mean the non-meaning part of language. They're the channels in which the meaning flows. They're the channels in which the meaning flows. Mm-hmm. And then like you say, the meanings of the word are learned by twisting these variables. So we learn the words within the broader context. So they are literally learned within the context of all of the entire bigger piece of information you get. So it completely appeals to your holistic view.
Right, sure.
We had no choice. It was not even like that we chose to do it like that. We had no other choice.
Right, so the entanglement is maintaining the complexity. I have a question about that, though, which is that, is it really the case that the entanglement that so happens to be quantum mechanics just happens to exactly align with the entanglement that we need for natural language processing? Is that just accidental?
It isn't me who picked vector spaces there. People start to work with vector spaces. So, you're already very close. If you then, I think the composition, the tensor structure is canonical. That comes like from the way grammar and all that works. That's just canonical. So the tensor product is canonical. So you got your vector spaces, your tensor product, that's canonical. What is not canonical is that suddenly there's complex numbers around. That doesn't come from standard NLP practice, although I have seen that there have been some papers where people use complex numbers in classical NLP to extend parameter spaces. And also there is some work by Triot, a French guy, I think, Triot, or where if you then start to factor entity embeddings and all like that to do this properly, you actually need complex numbers purely for analytical reasons. So they do come in. They do come in classical NLP too. But that's where the conceptual justification is much less. That's where the conceptual. But
Okay.
So one of the things I don't understand, like in the way, and you don't even have to think quantumly. You can think classical probabilistically. Like if you got two things, like let's just not talk. Let's talk ideologically more about like how meanings should interact and stuff like that. If we work with idealized meanings, so typically you got Alice and Bob, and then maybe Alice and Bob do something, but the way Alice and Bob are treated in any vector embedding is pretty much on their own. So you got an Alice vector and you got a Bob vector. It doesn't make sense to me because they've got they didn't just come from different planets and found each other. There is like a prehistory which connects them. And the way to connect that prehistory, like in classical probability, is some sort of correlations existing between them. That's not at all present in the way people now do NLP. Now, why not? It's probably very costly to do that. It's incredibly costly to do that. If you want to encode all these correlations, you get an exponential blow up. And that's something. So, but I think it's natural to do that. It's natural to assume that your different actors in whether you plays have some sort of pre-existing correlations with each other. It's always like that. And I mean, but that also tells me that the whole idea of static meanings is something we should go away from. So we are very much thinking in terms of not just like holistic meanings, but also dynamical meanings.
That's cool.
So I've got a paper called the Mathematics of Text Structure, which is from before the sort of talk. I mean, this was actually the start of trying to turn grammar into circuit-like things with evolving meanings. And it sort of then starts to subsume the grammatical structure. In that paper already, you see that some of the complexity of your traditional grammatical calculi is like kind of vanishing. It's simply that. I mean, you have to think you've got all this stuff on a line. So, I mean, here is a funny thing. Like, so a collaborator of me, Mernush Adrzadeh, she analyzed like the grammar in different languages and how far away words are communicating to each other in a single sentence. So you take huge sentences. Like in English, it's all kind of efficient because the English are all sort of very diplomatic, efficient people. If you go to something like Persian, then you have words on one side of the sentence, like a humongous sentence, which is informing a word on the other side of the sentence. Now, like these distances in the circuit, they go away. They all vanish. That's basically what happens. So in a lot of traditional grammar, you got this hopping from one sentence to another, very complex, boom, 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 boom. That all vanishes. That's what I mean by the complexity. It's sort of a much more efficient way of communicating between the words in a sentence if you just put them in a plane. That's what I mean. But all the rest stays the same, you know, like you can think of your words as wholes, and it's just the network which glues them together, which becomes much simpler. That's essential. So it's a different notion of complexity. If you're talking about complexity of representing the meanings, of course the entanglements are gonna, just like I was saying, like, oops, that's too much hand action. They were sort of the entanglements are gonna be humongous. They're exponentially huge. They're not maintainable on a classical machine. It's as simple as that. I mean, there's probably lots of tensor contraction tricks and all the sort of modern stuff dealing with tensor, which will help you a lot with that. We haven't really gone enough in it. It's something I actually really started to build up this team only a year and a half ago, and now we're starting to look properly in all these things with like a dedicated team in the industry. And like Steve Clark, I mean, he has a lot of experience in practical NLP by working many years at he has done his whole life like practical NLP. So it's good to have somebody like that on board, but it's also like believes in the stuff we are doing.
You have an algorithm to translate all of English into this kind of circuitry.
Yeah.
Could you just describe a bit how that algorithm works? And is the algorithm for, let's say, grammatically correct English, or is the algorithm would the algorithm parsing for something like, hey, what's up?
This is still in the idealized realm at this point. This is still in the idealized realm. So basically what you do, I kind of sort of hinted at before. So we got this picture. I can't show you our typical pictures of languages. You got like the meanings, words, they are sort of boxes. The meanings are boxes, and then they're wired together with grammar. So you actually have to go inside the boxes and put some wirings in there too. So, I mean, for certain words like relative pronouns, these are just like a bunch of wires. And for many functional words, these are just wires. If you go to things which actually have content, like a verb, then you got a little box in the big box, and then also a lot of wires. These wires, they're all very justified. We even have theorems that with the right representations, they come at no cost. So if you stick them inside and then let these wires interact with a grammatical structure, suddenly everything collapses into something much smaller.
But that is something.
It's a magical thing. It's a magical thing.
Have to know, okay, the word.
It's exactly like you were talking about Montague. You just need to know the type, not the meaning.
But you need to, your compiler needs to have a list of saying.
You need some CCG parser or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now
at this point you do.
Here's the maybe the heretic question. Could we learn these types? Yeah.
Ultimately, you want to. But I mean, we're working in sub-steps now. Like we actually got it's kind of a really cool tool we've got. Like whether you believe in what we do or not, it's really cool. You can type in whatever sentence and then it spits out a quantum circuit. You can actually, I mean, I don't think we've provided the link, but we've got it working. It's kind of cool. Anyway, it's funky. But yeah, I mean, so the question is, if you don't know so there's actually there's like this one paper I know by Smolensky and some Microsoft people who actually use also a quantum computer to come up with the parsing. Like just like you were saying, they come up with a probabilistic tree of what is the likely parsings here and there, and they can then of course deal with stuff which is not entirely grammatical. So, but they still use Smolensky's model. Which is way too complicated.
So, Bob, you wrote a 900-page book on, I think it's called "Picturing Quantum Processes," right? And you've been working on this formalism, actually, this pictorial formalism or calculus for quantum reasoning. I think you said since about 2004. And I've actually read your new book, which is aimed at high school students. I know you've got an idea, actually, that it might be possible to democratize quantum reasoning to the point that school kids can actually do it. And I read through it, and it was actually understandable even to me. So how did this all come about?
I mean, so I'm is part of my brain, and when we had to read a book at school, just reading a book at school, I mean, I hated it. I just always hated to read. It basically gave me an headache. I think there may be something to do with my missing part of my brain or whatever, but I just hate reading. I always hated reading. I mean, the idea to have like some black print on white paper and that's supposed to convey something to you, I've always thought it was completely absurd. So I'm a very visual person. So also mathematically, I think I've always thought very geometrically. There's no way, I mean, I don't understand, I can't stare at symbols. So that's something very personal. I know there's probably, some people are sort of more symbolic, algebraically minded, others are more geometrically minded. But in my case, it seems to be pretty extreme. Now the reason I got there was basically my hatred of quantum mechanics. I just thought the quantum formalism, there is something fundamentally wrong with. And then one of the places it seemed to me was this idea that what's more important than anything about quantum mechanics is the way systems interact. It's actually something I learned in hindsight that Schrödinger had said in the 30s and nobody had took attention from. So basically the key. So for Neumann always thought, what is the most important thing about quantum mechanics? I mean, I got the microphone here. It's like you start observing the microphone and what it does. I mean, observing a microphone would, for example, be speaking into it and stuff like that. You know, it's kind of quite analogous, and then inside something starts vibrating. So that was the Neumann's idea. You interact with a system, and then he came actually up with something which is called quantum logic. Like, what are sort of propositions we can attribute to that? And then this propositional structure is completely different from a Boolean algebra, it turns out. So Schrödinger said, no, it's not that. It's like what happens if I put a microphone next to the speaker. So I put the two together. He doesn't care what happens inside the microphone. He doesn't care what happens inside the speaker. What he cares about is if I put the two together, suddenly I get like this sound circus. You know, a new phenomena emerges, which was impossible to have with the microphone alone, and which was impossible to have with the speaker alone.
Yeah, and it's the same thing in intelligence. I mean, I'm fascinated by embodied intelligence and, you know, kind of like self-referentiality and the emergence of these kind of complex dynamical systems as a function of their interaction.
The thing, mathematical formalisms throughout they never actually focused on this sort of thing. They always start from, you describe I mean, you take a set with structure, and then you build your Hilbert space, and then maybe you take a tensor product for 2 Hilbert spaces. But you don't start discussing the interaction without actually, you have to know already that you're dealing with a Hilbert space before. And this thing is not a Hilbert space, the microphone, and the speaker is not a Hilbert space. So what is, how is there some match which connects them without having to say what they actually are? And that's actually, so the place where I started was category theory, and specifically tensor monoidal categories, because that's where you can do that. I mean, category theory books are the most horrible things to actually understand, and that's what it's supposed to describe. It's just horrible. It doesn't tell you that. But that's it. But then at the same time, for certain kind of categories, certain kind of nodal categories, you can show that they're completely equivalent to purely diagrammatic representation. So you first go very abstract, and then you end up with something which is so pure that actually becomes very simple. And then the idea, mathematically, of putting the microphone and the speaker together is basically just drawing 2 lines side by side. One line is the live line of the microphone, the other line is the live line of the speaker. And then the sort of structure of the stuff you can do before and after determines then that you can have this feedback loop. And in a Cartesian world where things wouldn't interact at all, like two completely non-interacting things, then these wires will never come together. They will always stay separate. But in a world where you've got maximal interaction, like in quantum mechanics or in language, you can actually have cup shapes between these 2 wires, like you probably read in the book, like these cup-shaped things. And if you look at Lambic pre-groups, he has exactly the same things, the cups and the caps, and that's just basically because words in a sentence, they communicate with each other within the sentence, of course. Otherwise, you wouldn't form a sentence if they were completely independent. There's no point forming a sentence. So, and there is nothing mystical about the fact that these 2 structures occur, say, in language and in quantum, because from if you understand them like mathematically, they basically say this is maximal communication. They're just the maximal mode of communication, while cutting them apart would be the minimal mode of communication. They're just maximal mode of communication. There's nothing more to it. So there's nothing mystical about language or some connection with quantum. Nothing. There's nothing there. So yeah, I mean, the insight to work with these diagrams was exactly the same insight to work with the right categorical structure. They came hand in hand too. It was just an accident that they happened to be diagrams. And then at the time, that was 2004, 2005, it seemed like a nice site, a nice project in itself to turn all of quantum mechanics diagrammatically. It sort of showed up as an opportunity by trying to axiomatize. So the real goal for me was trying to have an holistic, because the word was for holistic presentation of quantum mechanics through category theory, and that ended up becoming a diagrammatic formalism.
I think it's fascinating because I'm a big believer in creating powerful abstractions and interfaces and being able to reduce things to building blocks that hide away a lot of unnecessary complexity behind the interface. And that's what you've done. We see this in deep learning. I mean, we had Francois Cholet on the other week. He's created Keras, which is a deep learning library that completely abstracts away a lot of the complexities of deep learning. And I think actually your ZX calculus will democratize quantum reasoning for a whole new generation of folks that wouldn't be able to do it otherwise. So that's great. We've only got a few minutes left, and I just wanted to touch on the state of quantum hardware in general. Now, I know that you've just been appointed chief scientist at Cambridge Quantum Computing, and can you just completely break this down for us? Because there's so much hype and misinformation around quantum computing, and certainly at my workplace, we've got loads of people that are doing quantum computing, and everyone's talking about quantum computing, and I've just pretty much ignored it. I've filtered it out for years because I don't even know what the state of the art is. So can you just tell us in clear terms?
I mean, the best way to tell it is I'm now going to do like the sort of the context kind of thing. So in 2016, 2017, when we were dealing with this language formalism and the problem we had with the exponential size of the tensors, all that, I wrote a paper with a guy called Win Zhang, and we said, okay, well, let's see which algorithms we can use if we stick on a quantum computer. But I mean, I thought it was a joke. I thought this would never ever be possible to even get anything like that running on a quantum computer anywhere in the next 10 years. So what we have done in the last sort of experiments is we're training these circuits with libraries of like 100 to 150 sentences. I mean, they're quite complex sentences. And then we do some sort of naive question answering, and we get very nice convergences. So it's shocking that we can actually do that. It's shocking that we can do this now. I mean, there's of course no way that we compete with anything existing, but for me, it's shocking that we even can do it. Again, from like an NLP perspective, the thing which Google did with their 53 qubits is something that purely in terms of space requirements, like representational space requirements, you couldn't do in a classical machine. There's no computer infrastructures around in the world which would allow to store the same data. So we're already at a level that you can actually store more data in such a machine. I mean, with all the things that you can't access it and blah, 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 but you can store more data now in a 53 quantum computer than you can do in any existing computing system. But not store. It's not that you stick it in, but it is there. I mean, there is stuff in there that you can't. So if you understand, so it already is stretching beyond what's possible classical in some way. And this has gone incredibly fast, much faster than, I mean, I definitely imagine than many people imagine. And so the sort of chat has changed from is it going to happen to when it's going to happen. And I think nobody, even the skepticals in the field, are starting to think that it will not happen within 10 years.
So let me just challenge a couple things on that, because, you know, my coffee cup here stores more information than any current quantum computer, right? So information isn't necessarily useful, like in and of itself. This is why, for example, there's only a handful of 20 quantum mechanics algorithms, right? Because you know, the algorithms themselves have to fit in a form that's actually usable on a quantum computer. So I think you would agree we're still in the so-called NISQ era, right? Like the noisy intermediate.
Totally. And I mean,
okay.
I mean, totally. I mean, I didn't make any claim about predictions, you know.
Right.
I was very careful not to do that.
Understood.
I was just showing my surprise on how quickly it has gone, and the fact that we have been able to do what we are doing already on such a machine. I'm completely in shock.
Okay.
But I'm not making any projection, and I'm saying now that the general attitude, I think, within the community, including the skepticals, is now that in around 10 years you will have something practical.
Okay.
Although the hype currently says it's less. I wouldn't dare sort of to put a number on it. Like, I mean, if you really would force me, I think we can do something in 2-3 years that's meaningful. So just specifically for the language, I think we can do something in 2-3 years that's meaningful that you couldn't do on a classical machine.
Okay.
But that's by no means necessarily something you can sell.
Okay. So fair enough. On the other hand,
it would just be more a proof of concept.
Yeah. I mean, and fair enough, but I think part of that is due to, if I recall from one of your papers, part of that optimism is due to the fact that you were able to map some specific NLP problems to problems that could still function in a NISQ, like in a non-error corrected quantum computer. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, the results are pretty okay. The results are like comparative with a small scale experiment on classical hardware. If you would do really small scale experiment, like the data is clean enough. It's equally clean, more or less. So
sure. I just wanted to see if you agree that.
I mean, this probably has to do with the fact that NLP is noisy anyway.
Right. So I just wanted to make sure that you agree, because hype in and of itself can be a dangerous thing. It can lead people down, waste avenues. So
I mean, you don't have to tell me. We started this conversation with hype about ML and hype about string theory, and there's the same hype here.
Because in quantum computing, like the meaning of it has kind of changed over the years. Like in the early days, what quantum computing meant to theoreticians was error-corrected computing, like fault-free or whatnot. Computing. And because we haven't gotten to there yet, right, and we're still in the noisy era, it's now morphed into, well, it also includes, non-error corrected quantum computing. And I think like the 10-year timeline for error corrected, practically useful quantum computing is not correct. Like it's even not clear, can you do it with 1 million qubits, or do you need, 100 million qubits before you can start having effective, error corrected quantum computing? Is that fair, or am I wrong about that?
Well, I mean, it's very hard. I mean, let me start with a negative example, like fusion, nuclear fusion. I mean, I remember when I was, probably every single physics student since the Second World War has gotten lectures about, like, in 5-10 years there will be nuclear fusion reactors and they're clean and blah 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 blah. I got that lecture in the early 90s. In 5-10 years we've got fusion reactors. They're still not here. So these are things like engineering stuff like that is completely impossible to predict. Now the situation with quantum computer is much more complicated because of the different architectures, which each have their own different problems and advantages. So if you look at the superconducting stuff, which has been getting most of the attention recently, because that's what Google and IBM have, and Rigetti, the superconducting stuff, they're making good progress. They're making remarkably good progress, but there it's a lot of dealing. The noise dealings are really hard, and the sort of error correction seems pretty far still. Then you got, for example, the ion traps. These things are actually quite clean in themselves. You can go pretty deep with them. They have a harder time putting many qubits together, but I've been talking quite a bit to the IonQ guy, and they're thinking they've got a 100 qubit machine going. Now, a 100 qubit machine, if it's relatively clean and you don't have to do error correction, is a pretty amazing thing. This would be a pretty amazing thing. Now, when we're talking about fault tolerance and millions, then we're talking optics. Because, optics, light is kind of freely available everywhere, and light is incredibly stable. If it wasn't stable, we wouldn't be watching each other now. It's pretty amazing how nice behaved light is. So, I know the psi quantum guys, like, who get most of the money, they claim they're going to have something within 4 or 5 years. The guy I know is not like a bragger, but and the sort of system they use is completely different in architecture from anything like the IBMs so they're doing measurement-based quantum computing. So measurement-based quantum computing is this amazingly cool thing in itself, where you don't apply unitaries or you don't apply operations, you just measure. You do nothing else but measuring. Just tak, 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 tak. And the measurement dynamics actually is what your computation. So that's what they're doing. It's completely different architecture, which has anything anymore to do with any kind of computing. Is it going to work? We don't know. But so you got a few tracks here. You got a few tracks. So that's the difference with the fusion, where you only had one track. So it could be that two out of 3 completely fail. There's new tracks coming, by the way. It's not just these 3. There's a few other. So it's very hard to put your money anywhere because of these different architecture, which are completely different. Maybe, and I think the smart people, they don't. For a long time, people weren't really looking for a quantum computer, as in a universal computer, but certain quantum components. And they could actually come from the different machines together. You could have like this big hybrid thing where you take a little bit ion trap, a little bit condensed matter, a little bit like optics. So it's a very hard one to put any money on. It's a very hard one. But there is something like self-fulfilling prophecy. And to this, let me say 2 things about the hype. There is something like about self-fulfilling prophecy by like putting enough money into it. This happened to give a bad, well, it depends whether you call it a bad example. It happened with the Manhattan Project. I think you start your story with the Second World War and why academia in the US changed so much. It was probably because of the Manhattan Project. That they say if we can sort of make all these academics work on one thing together, they actually get it done. Which is what happened then. Like the guys, category theory was invented by 2 guys working on the Manhattan Project. In the evenings, they were doing that. They were there working on it.
Didn't know that.
Yeah. So yeah, and the other thing, so there is this self-fulfilling prophecy thing, the enormous amount of focus that's going into it, and the pressures from the hype can actually be helpful too, because there is this pressure we have to deliver, because there is this hype.
I'm glad that, in a way, I'm glad there is, because we've spoken about the hardware lottery on this channel quite a lot. And that is almost all of the scientific effort at the moment is determined by the previous investment and hardware decisions we've made in the past. We got a bit lucky with the GPUs and deep learning and so on, but we are in a basin of attraction in our research, and there's hardly any interesting new paths being taken.
Yeah, so another thing which I think is different from, well, it's probably the same with machine learning, that what's different from, like, say, string theory, which we're eating all theoretical physics jobs, is that most of the quantum stuff is happening outside academia with investment and money, which is complementary to the usual academic funding. So it's not going to sort of eat away the other disciplines. Most people just leave academia because the circumstances now to work on quantum are better outside academia than inside. It's as simple as that. And then the money comes from completely different sources, of course.
Yeah, same in deep learning.
That's what I'm saying. It's probably analogous there. So
Yeah.
I really don't understand why they're hiring so many machine learning faculty, because, I mean, it almost seems to me that the real good machine learning people, given the salaries outside and the relative freedom, why would they stay in academia?
Yeah, well, we spoke to a guy called Mark Serafin recently, and he wrote a blog post called the Great Stagnation in Machine Learning. But he was saying that machine learning people now are a bit like the previous Catholic high priests or something like that they don't have to risk anything. They can go and earn a 6-figure salary. They're just sotter chasing and just, reeling out the same old stuff. And, it's almost like zero risk.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, Professor Bob Coecke, thank you so much. It's been an absolute honor that you've joined us this evening, and I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, bro, you gotta get on the crypto, bro.
Why did Bitcoin do something today, or are we?
No, just the last few weeks, I guess.
What's happened to it?
It's
Let's
just
back up to above where it was before.
Enormously high, and
enormous
Ether
as in $50,000, or more than that.
Yeah, and Ether has made quite a thing. I mean, they're doing really cool stuff with Ethereum. Like, there's I don't know if the Berlin upgrade has already happened or is happening soon, but they're like really pushing stuff forward. There's like new math coming out of these communities. It's pretty cool.
Wow. So is it something that we should be paying attention to?
Too late.
I don't know
if it's from Yannick, I'll pay attention.
Well, if it not, I don't think it has a big connection to ML per se, because I mean the technology itself is almost orthogonal, right? Like there, it's either it's like super duper binary, like either your key fits or it doesn't. Either your proofs are correct or not, and if not, then it's infinitely bad. There's no notion of closeness or anything. Right. Yeah, I mean there is these topics of how can we do machine learning on blockchain and so on, but it's a bit of a tangent.
Would it be beneficial to have a couple of qubits? I can give you one. Oh, have we got one, Keith?
Oh, I'm
how
sorry,
many
I
qubits
wasn't
have we
paying
got?
attention.
Well, I'm just thinking we could if I gave you a qubit, could you give me some Ethereum?
A qubit?
Yeah, you can
like
have
a physical qubit.
Yeah.
How large is it?
I'm going to give you a quantum computer.
Yeah.
And you can have one of my qubits. Would that be enough for you?
I wouldn't even know how to remotely use that.
Well, I don't understand the question.
Yeah.
Are you asking if I would pay you for your qubits?
You would like to start mining Ethereum.
Yeah.
And what if I gave you a quantum computer?
I think that would break it. I think so. Most of the crypto technology today isn't actually quantum proof in their hashing, but as soon as quantum computers are on the market, they'll just switch to a quantum proof algorithm. So it wouldn't actually do anything.
Yeah, it might just make the where everybody can go back and troll all your old emails that have been stored in NSA or whatever, even if you've encrypted them, and find out what you said. And I guess they'd have to upgrade the blockchain. They'd have to go back and re-encrypt it and get everybody to switch over to a new chain.
So I'm in a startup now, my own actually. It sucks.
Go on.
It means that whenever I make a mistake, we go bankrupt.
It means that you're no longer welcome on Street Talk, Yannick, because we don't do startup.
Pitch your you don't start trying to pitch your startup.
Yeah.
No MBA speak. If you say anything about data products, then you'll be banned.
No, we just want to make the world a better place.
Of course
you do.
Yeah. Here's what you do. Make sure you put "don't be evil" in your corporate mission, and then 10 years from now, take it out.
So Kilcher, we'll give you this one opportunity. Give us the elevator pitch. You've got 30 seconds. What do your numbers look like for year 3?
We use
20 seconds.
We use transformers.
Of course you do.
Okay, good start.
I hope so.
You want to buy it?
Any blockchain in there?
No.
Does it solve the missing text problem?
Yes. It solves.
Is it the legal? Is it the legal software?
Yes, yeah, it's
Okay.
legal. It's
All right,
just
cool.
it's legal tech, and yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward application of sort of legal and like NLP to legal.
Is it information retrieval?
Yeah, it's some is information retrieval, yes, but there's lots of tasks, and there's lots of competition. But I think in Switzerland and in the German-speaking part, we sort of have a home field advantage.
Okay, so this is the debrief. We've just had a great show with Bob. What do you guys think about that?
I gotta tell you, so this is such a great example, at least for me, of how dialogue and just talking to somebody just brings a completely different understanding of their work. Because before, and I can't explain it, but I mean, before actually having a chance to talk with them, listen with them, interact, with Bob, it was like I really came across thinking this is a reductionist sort of silver bullet kind of, theory for how like everything is going to be solved by this particular quantum mechanical, formulation of NLP. And he's that's not his point at all. So I mean, yeah, I think this is an example of how things like, how on the internet, if you're in a forum or something or an email chain, things can spiral like out of control so quickly. And so it's just an example of how this iterative dialogue back and forth is such an important, communication mechanism. I wish we saw a lot more of it personally.
Maybe viewers here don't know this, but I at some point I looked at Discord and there were over, like, my notification counter was over 100 with people like sending back and forth papers and we're like, oh, and yeah, I felt the same thing. Like once you talk to someone and you let them talk, let them actually explain themselves, and also challenge them a bit on just your, let's say, if you have some worries, if you have some concerns about you just put that to them and give them a chance to express that. And I think we've almost never gone wrong doing that. And I think that makes the world much more interesting, because actually a lot of people seem to be much more reasonable and kind of down to earth and understanding than it would seem from just reading about them.
Yeah. No, nuance is so important. I was quite worried about this show for a few reasons, because first of all, it's definitely outside of our comfort zone. I mean, I don't really know anything about quantum, and Bob is such a strange beast. He is invoking many formalisms and approaches from computational linguistics that we haven't really seen for a very long time. A huge overlap with Walid Summer.
And you saw the path that he traveled, to get to where he's at. Very, eclectic journey, right?
Completely different. I love that, because he actually said he's an Oxford professor, and he's admitting that he's a very visual thinker, and he likes to think about problems in a different way. He's written a book about quantum reasoning for high school students, and I read that book the other day, and I'll do some stuff about it in the intro. But it's just so fascinating for me just to see the diversity, and also us to be out of our comfort zone, because as Cholet said, it's the intelligence is the information conversion ratio, and we're putting ourselves out there by challenging ourselves with a lot of material that we've not seen before. And then I was a bit worried, actually, because I thought that we would be challenging him on things like syntax, not semantics, and the missing information problem. And I personally don't believe strongly that his NLP system works particularly well, quantum or not. And we challenged him on that, and I thought we had a great exchange.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think personally, I don't think we should ever be afraid of. I mean, I know I know what happens, right? Because people come into the comments and whatever else. I mean, in my opinion, we're here to be, hosts. We're here to ask questions, whether they're dumb or not, whether, I don't care. Like, I'm not pretending to be somebody who knows everything the expert on the show knows. I mean, what would be the point of that? Just having we want to bring people along for a journey and kind of represent questions and evoke conversation to challenge where we're capable. I mean, that's how I view our role. So I'm not afraid to put myself out there and be deemed, an idiot. Like that's fine. I don't mind.
No, the explicit goal on any episode.
I don't even have to do anything differently to evoke that.
So you like Mark Twain, right? Like, better to be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt.
The only thing we need to be evoking is as many comments from Walid Sabra as possible. I think this will generate at least 3.
Yeah. So the important thing for me as well is, and you're saying that, like, getting out of our comfort zone, and I think getting sort of the mainstream, which is by definition the largest portion of people, out of their comfort zone. Because if you look at NLP today and you go on, I don't know, YouTube and all blogs and Reddit and so on, it's whatever, transformers, maybe some graph neural networks, maybe some LSTM, transformers, certainly some kind of neural network in there, certainly a big data set and scale and GPT-3. It is absolutely refreshing to see people doing completely different things.
Right.
And not saying that they're gonna replace neural networks. Like that is like the biggest credit to, let's say, him, or also people like Walid Saba who we had on. But just saying, like, look, there's stuff missing and no one's talking about it. And, we're here, even though it's not popular, we're here actually doing that stuff that's missing. And
Chalet's in the same boat too, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's, I think that's super, super cool.
Agreed.
Yeah, well, there you go. Putting ourselves out of our comfort zone, because we could just make a video about a Kaggle competition or...
Yeah, boring.
Yeah.
I mean, that stuff. So I don't know. I hope our listeners appreciate that we do this, because look, honestly, I'm out there trying to have fun. I'm out there trying to learn. I'm out there to try and bring along some other folks that want to have fun and learn. And this is a very fun thing to do. Like, have challenging conversations, to ask questions. What's more fun than asking a question and learning something? Jose Capablanca, like the sort of chess genius who was world champion for, I don't know, like 15 years or something absurd. I mean, just a natural born chess talent, and then started very early playing and became this phenomenal, force. And in his biography, he wrote that one of the darkest times of his professional career was when he felt like he would never lose another game, because he went through this streak where he just never lost. It was just draw, win, right? And, he said he learned so much from every game that he lost that he just was dismayed that he was in this situation where he's never going to have that experience of learning again. And that's what I love to learn and ask questions I don't know the answer to. I mean, that's the fun part, isn't it?
Well, it's scary.
Sure.
Like today, I mean, who
yeah,
say quantum computers. I mean, if you're not in that field, I don't know how you could possibly keep up with what's happening technologically, because it's just exploding. There's so much hype. There's so much stuff going on. And it was really cool to hear from him about these different, types of quantum computers, because honestly, the only ones I'd ever really paid attention to or saw kind of theoretical results were all about the, electron spin quantum computers. And so when he told me about this light-based, quantum computer, that fascinates me, because going back to when I was a kid, we used to read Scientific American articles or Discover articles or whatever about optical computing. And everybody's like, oh, optical computing, it's going to just, and you look in science fiction movies and they've got these optical chips and everything. Like in 2001, they're plugging in little clear crystal cylinders and, things like that. It's just cool, right? So now I want to go read about optical quantum computing and daydream about a world where we've got machines like that, right? So that's the fun part.
Yeah, the hype around quantum is a serious problem. That's why I've just learned to filter it out. Because normally when I'm reading articles or people sharing stuff on LinkedIn, or it's just surrounded by a smoky hype, and I just don't know what the state of the art is.
Says the AI consultant.
Well, I like to think that we are quite good at cutting through the bullshit here on Street Talk. We challenge ourselves a lot.
I think
I think we do. I'm the first to say that there's a lot of hype around deep learning. No, honestly, I think the Cholet episode was the most concise articulation yet of my opinion on the state of deep learning. I think deep learning is a wonderful pattern matching system for learning these continuous natural manifolds. And what's amazing is that some of it isn't hype. Deep learning really has been a revolution, right? I mean, just imagine that GAN, like interpolating between people's faces that don't exist. That's incredible. But yeah.
No, it completely is. What I push back against are the silver bullet people. Like that, we've got to understand, folks, that there's no one true solution to everything. The amazing and bizarre thing about reality is that it has, these theories and models kind of on multiple levels, whether you think about it as theories that emerge, or if you're a reductionist and you want to say you can always break things down to a finer level, that's still the same dimension, which is that there are multiple levels of operation and thought and theory and method, right? And so forget about silver bullets. They're not out there, okay? Deep learning, machine learning, fantastic for some problem space. It's not the solution to all our problems.
Deep learning is uniquely deceptive, and that's because it's a Parlour trick. So you can use deep learning for anything. You can make it pretend to be good at anything, even reasoning, any kind of software. As Cholet was saying, you can even model a continuous manifold around a discrete problem. So it's uniquely deceptive because you could say, well, I'm going to use this to do some reasoning, and it appears to work. At first sight, it appears to work. And that's why it's so deceptive. I can tell Yannick is thinking something.
While he's thinking, I'm going to say this, which is I think a lot of the deception comes from the fact that you have sort of theories like, that ReLUs are a universal function approximator, right? Or that this sort of thing. And people forget about the infinities that are kind of involved in those sorts of theories, right? And so when you forget about infinity, like Jaynes had this funny thing where he did this analysis of paradoxes, and he said, some people define paradox as something that's surprising to somebody. Well, then anything can be a paradox, right? And he actually goes so far as to construct a paradox generator. And the way that you do it is you set up a problem, okay, that depends on a limit, like it depends on the way in which you go to infinity, okay? You take the limit, and then you forget which limit you applied, and then derive some results, right? So it's like anytime you're kind of taking these limits to infinity and you forget that you've done that, then you get your mind into these weird situations. Yeah, so people get deceived by these results that come from infinity, and then kind of forgetting about it and not understanding that in a practical scenario, different tools work well in different situations.
Oh, are you talking about Turing completeness on neural networks by any chance?
That was like
not today. I'm not.
Wasn't that Schmidhuber in his talk saying like LSTMs are like the most powerful thing because they're Turing complete, and I made the point that so are crabs because people build these logic gates out of crabs. Right?
Yeah. What was his example with the NAND gate or something?
Well, you can build a NAND gate, and the NAND gate can build a CPU, and the CPU is Turing complete, right?
Yeah, but a CPU is not Turing complete.
Yeah,
it's only the FSM piece of a Turing complete system, right? Because you've got to have, and again, no practical machine is Turing complete, but this is not the point. The CPU also has read-write memory, so it has tapes and it has a thing which is driving it in this iterative, process. So like with RNNs, always like, oh, they're Turing complete. Here's the thing is, as far as I know, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, nobody takes, like every time you run an RNN, you run it in an unrolled way and you train it in an unrolled way, which is you have a finite look back. It's like I'm going to iterate, but only for some finite number of times. And then that's the score for that sort of set of data, which is a time series over a finite period of time, right? Like nobody runs an RNN where they just sit there and run it forever on a potentially infinite, input. And certainly nobody ever trains them in that way. Am I wrong?
Well, no, like practically you're not wrong. There are things like neural ODEs and stuff like this where you're trying to sort of predict what happens in the limit or at least after some continuous amount of time and things. But yeah, of course you're right in the practical setting, yeah. Sure.
Okay. Yes, I mean, sure. If you have an RNN and you're going to iterate it for a arbitrary amount of time, a potentially, infinite amount of time, and you supply it with some source of potentially infinite memory, like whether it's tapes that it can write to or potentially infinite registers that it can effectively treat as stacks or whatever, then you've just got a Turing machine, right? You just have a Turing machine where the finite state machine piece, the transition function, is an RNN. Like, so what? Like, that's not the point. The point is that RNNs, as people in this field typically envision them, right? Instead of redefining it as essentially a Turing machine, RNNs, as they typically envision them, are not Turing complete. Like, it's just that simple. I mean, it'd be like if back in the day, when people were working on finite state machines, and before they introduced pushdown automata, somebody just came along and go, oh, well, finite state machines are no different than pushdown automata because I can just like have an infinite number of nodes in my finite state machine, or I can add a stack to it too with like infinite precision registers. It's just stupid. I mean, the point is to create categories of computation to start to think about how they're different, how you might train them, et cetera. Not to just say everything is everything.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't, it's not useful.
I think it's a trap to think of neural networks as being computers. I think it makes much more sense, as Cholet says, just to think of them as statistical interpolators. Stop thinking that GPT-3 is running a program. It's not.
Well, I think with respect, maybe the last thing I'll say, but with respect to deep learning being a parlor trick and whatnot, I think you can I'd weigh this with 90%. Of being true, and the other 10%, I think we have to move from the other direction, where I think the perception is too much that things like logic and understanding and what we do as humans in our head is so abstract and is so symbolic and I think we also have to move a bit away from that to a point where you say, I don't actually really know how my thoughts come to be. I don't actually do the step-by-step inference all the time. I actually sort of more, do whatever, right? And that is still called intelligence. That is still called solving a problem or transmitting information and whatnot. So maybe for the last 10%, we also have to admit that we as humans are also a bit of a parlor trick sometimes, and we're still, it's just that the saying that deep learning is a bit of a parlor trick. It doesn't really run an algorithm. It doesn't really do the kind of computation we like someone at DeepMind might demonstrate it does, and so on. I just think that we as humans probably don't do that either some of the time, and it's still we call it intelligence, right? Still, I
agree with you on that, and I mean, and that's why I know in one of our shows we did, we were talking to somebody, and I was asking like, okay, well, what's missing, right, from neural net? Like, what is it that's in our brain that if we just added this to sort of computational neurons and whatnot, that we could now capture like whatever's. And I think that's a useful paradigm to think about, which is, let's start from the assumption that there's no magic there, and that whether it's a parlor trick or not, I don't know, but the point is to compare, like, what's different about what we're doing in this system versus this system, whether you're comparing an RNN to what a Turing machine does, or a Turing machine to a human being, or an RNN to a human being. Like, let's look for where the differences are, and that's what allows us to analytically break down what the differences are, and then turn around and synthesize, new systems and new models that have different capabilities. So I completely agree with that.
There you go. Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes down to the dichotomy between discrete and continuous.
Yeah, that bizarre, it comes up so many places, right? Like, topology is weird because it's both continuous and discrete. Yeah. You have these sort of things like a donut or two donut rings stuck together. They clearly have two holes, and that's a discrete thing. There's two holes there.
Yeah.
And yet you can deform the thing, you can allow all kinds of continuous deformations, but you can't get rid of those two holes. There's no way to get rid of those two holes. So there's, at the same time, you've got the continuity of the manifold and the deformations that you allow, and you have this discreteness of two holes. Or like in a wave packet, it has all these continuous things, but it has a hump. It actually has a hump there, some localized concept.
Well, on that, by the way, you heard it here first. Manifolds are dimpled. They're like golf balls. There's a new hypothesis of adversarial examples out called the dimpled manifold hypothesis, and I'm sure you'll be hearing about that before long from here.
Wait, what? No, where?
You didn't know about this? Well, Yannick doesn't check his email, so this is the first time in history that I know more information than Yannick does. Yannick will make a video about this next week, but you heard it from me first.
Where? Yes. Who said that?
Yeah, so manifolds are like dimples. Manifolds are like dimples. They've got little holes in. Don't tell Yannick, because it always really pisses me off how Yannick is so fast, and before I've even got a chance to read something, he's got a video out of it.
Don't scoop us.
No, a new theory, dimpled manifold
and it's not. You can't
easily explain.
You can't even access the paper.
No.
So Nicholas Carlini emailed us about this. Anyway, I was saying that, as you say, Yannick, there's a weird. The thing is, like, on the continuous domain, it's all about interpolating, right? And in system 2, it's like you're running a computer program. So there's such a weird interplay between those two worlds. But anyway, on that bombshell,
you're getting scooped. Tim. Like, Yannick's gonna find that paper and he's gonna make a video on it.
Send me the paper.
Yannick, can you promise?
This
Yannick, do you promise not to make a golf ball video on adversarial examples?
Before you do?
Yeah.
I promise. I won't make one before you do.
I'll never forget when we did the Yannick and I made a Francois Cholet video, and I spent weeks doing my video, and Yannick just like, he pipped me to the post, and that's the only time Yannick's really pissed me off.
I wasn't even aware.
He wasn't even aware.
Huh.
Because
he's just
us
a machine.
mere mortals over here, it takes us a long time to read papers.
This is the problem when you have a machine as a friend. They're just doing their thing, grinding forward mechanistically.
Exactly. Anyway, on that bombshell, see you next week.
Thanks.
Bye-bye, all.